The rain in Chicago never just falls, it assaults the pavement. Especially in late October, it carries a specific scent, a blend of rusted fire, escapes wet asphalt, and the kind of pervasive dampness that sinks directly into your bones. I was wiping down the laminate counter of the Nowhere Diner for the third time, not because it was dirty, but because the repetitive, mindless motion was the only thing grounding me in the dead quiet of the room. Outside the city was a blur of neon lights bleeding into puddles. Inside it was just me, the hum of the failing refrigerator, and the smell of old grease. It was 1:14 a.m. I was exactly 14 minutes past closing time. Then the front door blew open. The bell above it didn't just ring, it sounded sharply as the glass slammed against the peeling wallpaper. The biting wind howled into my diner, bringing with it the sharp, unmistakable metallic tang of fresh blood. Two men stumbled through the doorframe. They didn't look like they belonged in the same zip code, let alone the same room, but right now they were inextricably linked by the heavy caliber handguns they had pointed directly at each other's chests. The one on the left was a walking embodiment of the South Side. Broad shoulders, a heavy leather jacket soaked through with rain knuckles bruised and bleeding, and a jaw set like a cinder block. He looked like the kind of man who solved his problems with a crowbar and didn't lose a second of sleep over it. Vance, if the whispered rumors from the alleyway junkies were to be believed. The one on the right was from another world entirely. He wore a ruined bespoke three-piece suit that probably cost more than my diner's annual lease. His dark hair was slicked back, ruined by the rain, and a jagged cut across his cheekbone. His eyes were cold, calculating, and vicious. Tristan, the Gold Coast phantom who ruined lives with a fountain pen and a whispered threat. "Give me one reason not to paint this wall with your brains," Tristan said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "Because you'd be dead before the casing hit the floor," Vance replied grimly, not shifting an inch. I watched them from behind the counter. The air in the diner was practically vibrating with their projected authority. It was that heavy, suffocating pressure that powerful alphas leak when they are pushed to the absolute edge. A normal omega would have been on their knees by now, choking on the sheer weight of the pheromones, their instincts screaming at them to submit or run. I just picked up a greasy rag from the sink and tossed it across the room. It landed with a wet smack against the edge of the nearest vinyl booth. Both men snapped their heads toward me, their guns wavering for a fraction of a second. "Clean the blood off my floor," I said. My voice was entirely flat, devoid of the tremor they clearly expected. "Put the guns away, or go back out into the alley and shoot each other there. You are tracking mud, and it is past my closing time." Silence stretched between us, thick and dangerous. They stared at me like I was a ghost, or perhaps just a madman. I didn't care which. I turned my back on two of the most dangerous men in Chicago, a suicidal move by any metric, and walked into the cramped kitchen. I grabbed two heavy ceramic bowls and ladled out the last of the beef stew I had been keeping warm on the back burner. The rich, savory steam curled into the air. I walked back out and set the bowls heavily on the counter, right next to each other. "Eat," I said, leaning against the register, "before it gets cold." I don't know if it was the sheer absurdity of the situation, the paralyzing exhaustion in their bones, or just the fact that they had not eaten in days, but the tension slowly deflated. Vance lowered his gun first, exhaling a heavy breath. Tristan followed a second later, his jaw tight. They approached the counter warily, keeping a cautious distance from each other, and sat down. For the next 10 minutes, the only sound in the diner was the clinking of spoons against ceramic and the steady drumming of the rain outside. They ate like starving wolves, abandoning their lethal grace for primal hunger. I stood there watching them, feeling absolutely nothing. When they finished, Tristan pulled a crisp $100 bill from a silver clip and threw it on the counter. Vance tossed down a crumpled 50 stained with something red. They stood up, exchanged one last lingering glare of mutual hatred, and walked back out into the storm without a word to me. The diner was empty again. I walked over to the counter to clear their bowls. As I picked up Tristan's plate, I paused. There was a smear of thick brown gravy left on the rim. Slowly, deliberately, I dipped my index finger into it and brought it to my tongue. 5 years ago, a Michelin-starred alpha, my mentor, my partner had systematically stripped me of everything. He stole my recipes, claimed my innovations as his own, and when I threatened to expose him, he destroyed my reputation. The betrayal had broken something fundamental inside my brain. Psychological adousia, the doctors called it. I lost the ability to taste food, to feel joy, to to experience any spark of anticipation. My world went entirely gray. The only thing I could taste bizarrely was the emotional residue left behind by others in the food I served them. I closed my eyes. I expected the sauce on Tristan's plate to taste like gunpowder, like arrogance, like the cold metallic sting of cruelty. Instead, it tasted like a heavy, suffocating exhaustion. It tasted like the kind of bone-deep loneliness that keeps a man staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning. Frowning, I moved to Vance's bowl. I tasted the remaining drop of broth. It was a different texture of grief, perhaps more jagged, less refined, but fundamentally, it was the exact same empty, hollow isolation. I opened my eyes and looked at the closed door, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the window. 2 ruthless monsters had just sat in my diner, and the only thing they left behind was the exact same flavor of sorrow that I lived with every single day. I wiped the counter clean, locked the front door, and turned off the open sign. For the first time in 5 years, I found myself wondering if they would come back tomorrow. They did not shoot each other that first night. I figured that was a temporary oversight, a clerical error in the violent bureaucracy of the Chicago underworld. By all metrics of logic, they should have been pulling bodies out of the Chicago River by Sunday. Instead, on Tuesday night, exactly at 11:15 p.m., the loud bell above my door announced their return. They did not come together. Vance arrived first, shaking rainwater off his broad shoulders like a wet mastiff, taking the booth in the far left corner. 10 minutes later, Tristan ghosted through the door, his umbrella impeccably dry, taking the stool at the absolute opposite end of the counter. They glared at each other. They ordered black coffee. They sat in suffocating hostile silence until I kicked them out at 2 a.m. Then came Wednesday and Thursday. By Friday night, my sanctuary of solitude had been thoroughly breached. The diner was suddenly inexplicably at capacity. It was not the usual late-shift nurses or insomniac cab drivers. Half the room consisted of men with broken noses and heavy leather jackets pretending to be deeply fascinated by their cold fries. The other half were men in tailored suits with earpieces nursing single cups of green tea with the vigilance of palace guards, South Side Muscle, and Gold Coast security. They had followed their respective bosses to the Nowhere Diner. The sheer density of aggressive, suppressed alpha pheromones in the room was enough to strip the peeling paint off my walls. I was the only person working. I was the cook, the waiter, the busboy, and the dishwasher. By 1:30 a.m., my patient's usually a vast and empty reservoir was bone dry. The stack of dirty plates next to the sink was leaning precariously, threatening to avalanche onto the cracked linoleum. I wiped my hands on a grease-stained towel, walked out from behind the counter, and marched straight toward the 2 epicenters of this disaster. "Both of you," I said, pointing a flat finger at Vance, then at Tristan. "Kitchen, now." The entire diner went dead silent. You could hear the neon sign buzzing frantically outside. 30 pairs of eyes snapped toward me. I heard the collective subtle rustle of heavy jackets as heavily armed men waited to see which boss would order my execution. Vance slowly lowered his ceramic mug. Tristan arched an elegant dark eyebrow. "Excuse me," Tristan murmured, a dangerous velvet edge to his voice. "You heard me. Kitchen." I did not blink. "You brought half the Chicago syndicate into my diner. I am out of clean bowls, my feet hurt, and I am not serving another plate of food until this sink is empty. So, unless you want to eat your next meal out of your cupped hands, get behind the counter." For a terrifying, stretched-out second, nobody moved. Then Vance let out a low, gravelly snort. He slid out of his booth, cracking his knuckles, and walked past me into the narrow kitchen. Tristan's jaw tightened clearly, infuriated that Vance had complied first, and he smoothly slid off his stool to follow his posture rigid with offended dignity. I walked in behind them and pulled 2 aprons off the hook by the pantry. I did not just hand them over, I tossed them directly at their chests. They were neon yellow, the kind of blinding synthetic yellow that burned the retinas, complete with a faded, slightly cross-eyed cartoon hot dog printed on the front. "Put them on," I commanded. "The water is hot. The soap is under the sink." Tristan held the neon plastic between 2 fingers like it was a biohazard. "I am wearing a $3,000 Vesuna wool suit, Julian. I have a board meeting to hostile take over a pharmaceutical company at 8 in the morning." "Then roll up your sleeves carefully," I replied, leaning my hip against the prep table. Vance had already shoved his arms through the strings of his apron. It was comically small on him, the fabric stretching tightly over his broad, heavily muscled chest. He turned on the hot water, entirely ignoring Tristan. "Are you going to cry about the dry cleaning princess, or are you going to wash a plate?" Vance rumbled. Tristan's eyes flashed absolute murder. He snatched the second apron, tied it behind his back with aggressive precision, and stepped up to the double sink. What followed was the most surreal petty display of alpha dominance I had ever witnessed. They did not just wash dishes, they went to war over them. Vance scrubbed a ceramic bowl with the brute force of a man trying to erase a blood debt, while Tristan rinsed and stacked plates with terrifying surgical efficiency. "You missed a spot of grease, you absolute animal," Tristan whispered sharply, shoving a wet plate back into Vance's soapy water. "Maybe if you didn't take 10 minutes to rinse a single spoon, we would be done by now. Wall Street." Vance growled splashing suds deliberately onto Tristan's pristine shirt cuffs. Underneath the sink, I distinctly heard the dull thud of a tailored Italian loafer kicking a heavy combat boot. A muffled curse followed. They were literally kicking each other under the counter for the optimal standing position. Two titans of the criminal and corporate world wearing neon yellow hot dog aprons, covertly fighting over a wet sponge just to get done faster. I stood by the prep station, arms crossed, watching them. I picked up a piece of a discarded celery stick from the cutting board, part of the prep they had interrupted. I popped it into my mouth. I did not expect to taste anything. I never did. But as the flavor profile hit my tongue, I froze. It was not the hollow, suffocating grief of the first night. It was not the metallic tang of anger or the bitter ash of their usual cruelty. It tasted bright, like a sharp, fizzy burst of lemon peel. It tasted like adrenaline, yes, but mixed with a bizarre, stubborn kind of amusement. They were having fun. The sheer absurdity of the situation, the release of not having to be terrifying monsters for 10 minutes, was bleeding into the air and soaking into the food around them. I swallowed hard, and then before I could stop myself, my chest hitched. A sound escaped my throat, a quiet, breathy sound. Both men froze. They dropped the sponge. They snapped their heads toward me, their eyes wide, soapy water dripping onto the cracked floor tiles. It took me a second to realize what the sound was. It was a laugh. It was small, rusty from years of disuse, and barely audible over the running water, but it was unmistakably a laugh. My world had been entirely gray for 5 years, but looking at the two most dangerous men in Chicago glaring at me over a sink full of suds, I felt a tiny, fragile crack form in the ice. "Do not stop," I said, my voice softer than before, quickly masking the tremor in my hands. "You still have the stew pots to do." The armies retreated by the second week of November. I did not ask what threats were whispered or what bones were broken to make it happen, but the sudden influx of heavily armed goons and corporate security abruptly stopped. The diner returned to its usual suffocating quiet, but it was not a solitary quiet anymore. It had become a heavily fortified, demilitarized zone guarded by the two most dangerous men in the city. They no longer sat at opposite ends of the counter, slowly like two apex predators negotiating a very precarious truce at a watering hole. They had migrated closer to the center. They still did not speak to each other much, mostly communicating in low grunts, raised eyebrows, and the occasional subtle slide of a salt shaker. But the killing intent was gone, replaced by a strange, heavy domesticity that made absolutely no sense in my grease-stained world. It started with the neon sign. The letter W in nowhere had been flickering for 3 years, a frantic, buzzing strobe light that gave me a headache on rainy nights. On a Tuesday, Vance walked in at midnight, not with a handgun, but with a battered canvas tool bag. He did not say a word to me. He just walked right back out the front door, set up a ladder, and went to work. For an hour, the only sound was the metallic clink of a wrench and the low rumble of his breathing. When he finally came back inside, his massive hands were smeared with black grease, but the buzzing had stopped. The sign burned a steady, solid red through the fog. I slid a bowl of hot, thick potato soup across the counter. He took it with a single sharp nod of gratitude and ate in comfortable silence. When he finished and left, I took his bowl to the sink. There was a drop of the thick potato base left on the rim. Almost unconsciously, my finger swiped it, bringing it to my tongue. I closed my eyes, bracing for the hollow emptiness I was so used to. Instead, the flavor hit me with a slow, grounding weight. It tasted like marrow, like bone broth that had been simmering on a low fire for 24 hours. It was not flashy or aggressive. It was entirely rustic, deeply savory, and overwhelmingly steady. It tasted like safety. The realization hit my chest with the force of a physical blow. Vance, a man who ran the most violent syndicate on the South Side, was projecting an aura of absolute immovable protection, and he was projecting it directly at me. I gripped the edge of the sink, my knuckles turning white, terrified of how desperately I wanted to lean into that heavy, quiet warmth. Then there was Tristan. If Vance was the foundation, Tristan was the storm trying to rip the roof off. He did not fix things, he brought things. Extravagant, ridiculous things that had no business being in my kitchen. On Thursday night, he walked in wearing a midnight blue velvet blazer, placing a pristine temperature-controlled silver case directly onto my cracked laminate counter. He unlatched it to reveal 3 pounds of Wagyu beef, marbled so perfectly it looked like art, and a small glass jar containing 2 massive white truffles. "Cook," Tristan said, leaning his chin on his hands, his dark eyes tracking my every movement with a focus that made my skin prickle. "I'm tired of watching you eat dry toast at 2 a.m., Julian. I want to see what you can actually do." It was a blatant power play, but it lacked the toxic arrogance of my former mentor. Tristan was not demanding I perform for his ego. He was demanding I stop hiding my own talent. I did not argue. The chef buried deep inside me, the one I thought had died 5 years ago, woke up at the sight of those ingredients. I seared the Wagyu in a cast iron skillet, letting the rich fat render out, filling the diner with a scent so decadent it almost felt illegal. I shaved the white truffle over it, my hands moving with a fluid, forgotten grace. Tristan did not just eat it. He devoured it, though, with much better table manners than Vance. He watched me the entire time, his eyes burning with a dark, intense satisfaction. When he finally departed in his sleek black car, I picked up his plate. A single drop of the rendered Wagyu fat remained near the edge. I tasted it. The flavor profile exploded in the back of my throat. It did not taste like beef. It tasted like smoked chili. Sharp, brilliant, and demanding absolute attention. It was the kind of heat that made your eyes water but forced you to take another bite. It was adrenaline and desire, aggressive but incredibly refined, leaving a lingering profound warmth that settled deep in my stomach. Tristan's emotions were not safe like Vance's. They were a challenge, an awakening. He wanted to strip away my numbness and burn down the gray walls I had built around myself. I stood in the center of my empty diner, the smell of truffles and engine oil hanging in the air. 2 alphas, 2 entirely different flavors of devotion. Both of them were quietly, patiently dismantling the ruins of my life. It was Friday night. The wall clock ticked over to 11:10 p.m. I was standing by the industrial espresso machine. Without thinking, my hands moved on autopilot. I grabbed 2 heavy ceramic mugs. In the first, a double shot of espresso pulled exactly for 28 seconds, the bitter dark roast Tristan preferred. In the second, simple black drip coffee, steaming hot exactly the way Vance liked it. I set the 2 mugs on the counter. Outside, the street was completely silent. I had not heard an engine. I had not heard a footstep. Yet I was already anticipating them. I was preparing for them. I stared at the 2 cups of coffee, the steam curling into the neon-lit air, and for the first time in 5 years, I realized I was waiting for someone to come home. I was making a demi-glace. That was my first mistake. You do not make a 24-hour veal reduction in a run-down diner that primarily serves frozen fries and reheated chili, but the routine of it, the careful skimming of impurities, the slow, methodical deepening of the sauce, it felt necessary. I was anticipating them. Tristan had mentioned wanting to try my take on a classic Bordelaise, and Vance just liked watching me cook. It was 1:45 a.m. on a Wednesday. The diner was empty save for me and the quiet simmer of the stock pot. Then the front window of the nowhere diner did not just break, it detonated inward. The concussive blast of shattering safety glass was deafening. The freezing November wind howled through the massive gaping hole where my storefront used to be, bringing with it 6 men in heavy black tactical jackets and ski masks. They carried crowbars and steel pipes. I did not scream. My instincts, honed by years of emotional deadening, simply locked my body into a rigid, icy stillness behind the prep counter. Message from the West Side. The largest one grunted, his voice muffled by the mask. Tell your alpha boyfriends their sanctuary is officially condemned. They did not attack me. They attacked the diner. It was a systematic, brutal execution of the only space in the world that belonged to me. A steel pipe swung into the glass pastry display, shattering it into a million glittering shards. A crowbar smashed into the industrial espresso machine I used for Tristan's coffee, ripping the steam wand off and sending scalding water hissing across the floor. They overturned the booths, slashed the vinyl seating, and took a baseball bat to the neon nowhere sign humming above the register. A flying shard of heavy ceramic from a smashed coffee mug clipped my cheekbone. I felt the warm, thin trail of blood slide down my jaw, but I barely registered the sting. I was suffocating. Not from the dust, but from the overwhelming tidal wave of malicious intent flooding the room. The air tasted like ash. It tasted like shattered porcelain raw cruelty and the bitter metallic tang of absolute powerlessness. It was 5 years ago, all over again. My Michelin-starred mentor standing in my pristine kitchen, firing me, taking my recipes, taking my joy, tearing down everything I had painstakingly built, while I stood there, unable to stop him. The panic did not hit my chest. It hit my brain, a white-hot, blinding static that paralyzed my vocal cords. In less than 3 minutes, they were gone, peeling out of the alley in 2 black SUVs. I was left standing in the ruins. The wind whipped rain into the dining room, soaking the shattered laminate floor. The simmering demi-glace had been knocked over the rich, dark sauce, pooling with rainwater and broken glass like congealing blood. My hands began to shake. Not a subtle tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shaking. The tiny, fragile world I had just started to piece back together, the quiet warmth, the shared silence, it was gone, crushed under the boots of the Chicago syndicate. 5 minutes later, the screech of tires echoed through the alley, 2 engines revving with an intensity that sounded like a roar, the heavy slam of car doors. Vance and Tristan burst through the skeletal frame of the front door simultaneously. They looked like monsters. The polished veneer was entirely stripped away. Vance had a heavy caliber rifle gripped in his hand, his eyes wide feral and sweeping the room for targets. Tristan's vicuna wool coat was soaked, his chest heaving, his face pale and contorted with a kind of murderous, unhinged panic I had never seen on a corporate CEO. The sheer density of their alpha pheromones hit the room like a physical shockwave. It smelled of ozone-burning sulfur and raw, unrestrained terror. "Julian!" Tristan choked out, his eyes locking onto me behind the counter. He dropped his weapon onto a broken table and lunged over the shattered counter, closing the distance between us in seconds. Vance was right behind him, his massive frame practically vibrating with the need to shield, to destroy whatever had done this. "Julian, look at me. Let me see your face." Tristan demanded, his hands reaching out, trembling violently as he tried to cut my bleeding cheek. "Do not touch me." My voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It was entirely dead. The absolute zero of my tone stopped both of them dead in their tracks. Tristan's hands hovered an inch from my face. Vance froze, his jaw tight enough to crack his own teeth. "Julian," Vance rumbled, a low pleading sound deep in his chest. "We are going to kill them. Every single one of them. Just let us get you out of here." "Get out." I stepped back, my boots crunching loudly on the broken ceramic of the espresso cups I had bought specifically for them. I looked at the overturned stools. I looked at the ruined demi-glace. Then I looked at the 2 most dangerous men in the city. "You brought this?" I whispered, the tremor in my voice finally breaking through the ice. "You brought the trash of the world into my kitchen." "Julian, please, it was a retaliation hit we did not know." Tristan started his usual silver-tongued eloquence, shattering under the weight of my stare. "I did not ask for your wars." I finally shouted, the sound ripping from my throat, raw and agonizing. "I did not ask for your protection. I did not ask for either of you. I just wanted to wash the dishes in peace." I grabbed the edge of the stainless steel sink, my knuckles turning white as I desperately tried to ground myself against the overwhelming tide of panic and grief. "You made me feel safe. You made me think I could taste things again without choking on the poison of your world." I looked at them, my vision blurring with hot, angry tears I refused to let fall. "Get out," I said, my voice dropping back to a hollow, devastating whisper. "Get out of my diner before you destroy the last bit of taste I managed to find." Silence descended on the ruins, heavier than the rain outside. Tristan looked like he had been shot. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire was staring at me with an expression of such profound devastation it made my chest ache. Vance's broad shoulders slumped, the feral violence draining out of him, leaving only the crushing weight of a man who realized his very presence was a weapon. They did not argue. They did not try to force their way into staying. They looked at the blood on my cheek, the ruined kitchen, and finally they looked at each other. Slowly, carefully, Vance backed away. Tristan lowered his hands, his dark eyes never leaving my face before he turned around. They walked out into the freezing November rain. They did not get into their cars. They just stood there in the downpour, two titans of the underworld standing guard over a pile of broken glass, and a chef who had just locked them out of his heart. I nailed cheap heavy plywood over the shattered front window of the diner. For 7 days, that piece of wood was the only barrier between my fragile, empty existence and the rest of Chicago. I did not turn on the open sign. I did not clean the spilled demi-glace. I just sat in the dark, wrapped in a heavy wool sweater, staring at the dust motes dancing in the slivers of gray streetlight that bled through the cracks in the wood. The silence in the diner was not peaceful anymore. It was a suffocating, ringing vacuum. For the first 48 hours, I convinced myself I had done the right thing. I had protected my sanctuary. I had surgically excised the tumor of the criminal underworld from my life before it could metastasize and kill me. But by the third day, the numbness returned in full force. I tried to eat. I made a simple bowl of pasta, perfectly al dente, tossed in good olive oil and garlic. I put it in my mouth and chewed. It tasted like damp cardboard. It tasted like nothing. The tiny, fragile spark of flavor I had begun to cultivate over the past few weeks had been entirely extinguished. I was back in the absolute zero of my psychological agesia, and lying awake at 4 a.m., staring at the water stains on my apartment ceiling above the diner, the truth finally clawed its way through my defensive walls. I had not kicked Vance and Tristan out because they brought danger. I grew up in the foster system and worked in kitchens run by sociopaths. Danger and I were old acquaintances. I kicked them out because I was terrified. When my Michelin-starred mentor destroyed me 5 years ago, he did not use a steel pipe. He used my trust. He made me rely on him, and then he pulled the floor out from under me. Watching Vance and Tristan in my kitchen, smelling the truffle and the bone broth, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of their devotion, it had felt exactly like hoping again. And hoping was the most dangerous thing a broken man could do. I had locked them out to preemptively save myself from the inevitable moment they would get bored and leave. But they did not leave. I did not own a television, but you did not need one to hear the tectonic plates of the Chicago underworld shifting. By the fourth day, the whispers bled into the alley. The old man who delivered my produce knocked on the back door, his eyes wide, telling me about the bloodbath on the west side. It was an unprecedented alliance. The brute force of the South Side Syndicate and the surgical financial ruin of the Gold Coast factions moving in absolute terrifying synchronization. Warehouses were burned, accounts were frozen, kneecaps were shattered. In less than 72 hours, the gang that had thrown a crowbar through my window ceased to exist. It was not a gang war, it was an extermination. It was an apology written in ash and broken bones delivered by two men who did not know how to say, "I am sorry," without burning a city down. By the sixth night, the temperature in Chicago dropped below freezing. The rain turned into a hard, biting sleet. I was standing by the prep counter at midnight when I felt it, a heavy, familiar pressure settling over the alley behind the diner. Not an intrusion, but a blockade. I walked to the back window and looked out through the frosted glass. Parked at the mouth of the alley, blocking any possible entrance, were two vehicles, a battered black tactical SUV and a sleek, custom-built Aston Martin. Their engines were idling, the exhaust pluming into the freezing night air. They did not knock. They did not try to come in. Vance and Tristan just sat in their respective cars in the dead of winter, standing a silent, immovable guard over a diner that was not even open. They stayed there all night. And the next night, on the seventh day, the clock hit 1:45 a.m. I looked at the empty, ruined kitchen. I looked at the plywood over the window. The grayness inside my chest was so heavy, I could barely breathe. Safety without feeling was not safety. It was just a very quiet coffin. I walked over to the espresso machine. I reattached the steam wand they had paid a mechanic to fix before the attack. My hands moved with a sudden frantic urgency. I pulled a double shot of the darkest, most bitter roast I had. Then I set up a filter and brewed a heavy black drip coffee. I poured them into 2 thermal travel mugs. I walked to the back door. The metal security gate was rusted and it made a loud screeching sound as I shoved it upward. The freezing wind hit me instantly, biting through my thin sweater. The alley was dark, illuminated only by the red taillights of the 2 vehicles. The moment the metal gate screeched, both car doors opened simultaneously. Vance stepped out of the SUV, his heavy coat catching the sleet. Tristan emerged from the Aston Martin, the collar of his wool coat turned up against the wind. Both of them froze their eyes, locking onto me. They looked exhausted. The feral, untouchable aura of the alpha predators was completely gone, leaving only the raw, tense anxiety of two men waiting for a verdict. I did not speak. I did not think my voice would hold if I tried. I walked slowly down the icy concrete steps. The distance between the back door and their cars felt like a mile. I could feel the density of their pheromones, no longer ozone and sulfur, but a desperate, suppressed pleading. I walked right up to the hood of Tristan's Aston Martin. I set the travel mug of espresso down on the freezing metal. Then I turned to Vance's SUV and placed the black drip coffee on his hood. I stood in the space between them. The sleet was melting into my hair. Tristan stared at the cup on his car, his chest rising and falling unsteadily. Vance looked at me, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. "It is freezing," I finally said, my voice quiet, cutting through the wind. "Drink it before it gets cold." I did not wait for an answer. I turned my back to the two most lethal men in the city, walked back up the stairs, and stepped inside. But this time, I did not pull the metal security gate down. I left the door unlocked. I walked back into the kitchen, leaned against the counter, and waited. I did not have to wait long. Exactly 3 minutes after I left the back door unlocked, the rusted hinges creaked. Heavy boots stepped onto the cracked linoleum of the kitchen. I did not turn around immediately. I stood by the prep counter, gripping the stainless steel edge, listening to the sound of two men shrugging off their frozen, sleet-soaked coats. When I finally turned, the breath hitched slightly in my throat. They looked nothing like the untouchable titans of the Chicago underworld. Their hair was plastered to their foreheads, melting ice dripping down their jaws. The sharp, immaculate lines of Tristan's expensive tailoring were ruined, and Vance's heavy tactical gear looked more like a burden than armor. They were shivering, exhausted, and completely stripped of their alpha bravado. They walked into the diner, but this time they did not claim opposite corners. They moved together a united front and sat side by side on two battered vinyl stools directly across the open kitchen counter from me. The silence between us was not suffocating anymore. It was expectant. "The garbage has been taken out," Tristan said softly. His voice was raspy from the freezing wind, lacking its usual velvet smoothness, but the absolute certainty in it was unmistakable. "The West Side, the Gold Coast factions. It is done, Julian. Nobody will ever throw a stone at this glass again. You do not have to hide anymore." Vance rested his massive forearms on the counter. He looked at the empty sink, then looked directly into my eyes. His gaze was incredibly grounding, completely devoid of the feral violence I had seen a week ago. "I noticed the dishwasher is still broken." Vance rumbled his deep voice, carrying a quiet, immovable weight. "Let us do it. We will wash the plates every night, permanently. Just let us stay." It was not a proposal built on grand empty gestures. It was a promise of mundane, enduring presence. It was the most romantic thing I had ever heard in my miserable life. I looked at them, two lethal predators who had burned down a city, just to sit at my broken counter and ask for permission to wash my dishes. The gray, icy fortress I had built inside my chest for 5 long years finally cracked wide open. "You do not know what you are asking for," I whispered, my voice trembling. I stepped closer to the counter, the barrier between us shrinking. "You think I am just a chef hiding from the world, but I am broken." They did not interrupt. They just watched me, their attention entirely anchored to my words. 5 years ago, I did not just lose my restaurant, I lost my mind. I continued the confession, tasting like dry ash on my tongue. Psychological adousia. I do not taste food, Tristan. I do not feel joy. I do not feel anticipation. My entire world is a flat gray line. The only thing I can taste is the emotional residue people leave on their plates. I am a defective machine. I do not know how to be happy. I gripped the counter, my knuckles white. You do not want a broken Omega who cannot even taste his own cooking. The neon sign buzzed outside. The sleet hit the plywood over the window. Tristan did not look pitied. He looked deeply, profoundly understanding. He reached across the counter, his elegant, freezing fingers gently wrapping around my white-knuckled grip. "Julian," Tristan murmured, his thumb brushing against my skin, sending a spark of sharp electric warmth straight up my arm. "We have enough money to buy any Michelin-starred meal in the world. We did not come here for a culinary genius. We came for you." Vance reached out and placed his large, calloused hand over both of ours. The heat radiating from him was instantaneous, a deep protective hearth fire. "If your world is gray, We will just have to be loud enough to bleed through it," Vance said, simply, his dark eyes fiercely tender. "We do not need you to fake a smile for our egos. If you cannot taste joy, Julian, we will just make it for you. Every single day, until you remember how." I stared at their overlapping hands holding mine. A single hot tear broke free, tracking through the healed cut on my cheekbone. I did not wipe it away. I slowly pulled my hand back, not in rejection, but in purpose. I turned to the stoves. I did not ask them what they wanted. I grabbed a cast iron pot, ignited the heavy gas burner, and went to work. My hands moved with a fluidity and passion I had not felt in half a decade. I browned short ribs to glaze the pan with a heavy, dry red wine and tossed in fresh herbs, letting it reduce into a thick, glossy ragu. Then I dropped fresh handmade pappardelle into boiling salted water. I did not serve them in two separate bowls. I plated the rich, dark pasta in the center of one massive rustic serving dish and slid it across the counter between them. 2 forks. They did not hesitate. They ate together, their shoulders brushing, sharing the meal in the quiet warmth of a kitchen that finally felt alive again. I stood by the stove watching them. The suffocating scent of the underworld was gone. The diner smelled like rich wine-braised beef and an overwhelming, staggering amount of devotion. When they were finished, Vance pushed the dish slightly toward me. A small spoonful of the dark, glossy ragu remained. My hand shook slightly as I picked up a spoon. I scooped the remaining sauce and brought it to my mouth. I closed my eyes, bracing for the familiar hollow emptiness. It did not come. Instead, a profound, harmonious symphony of flavor rushed over my senses. It began with the deep, rustic, unshakable safety of bone broth, the immovable foundation of Vance. And then woven flawlessly through it was the sharp, brilliant, electrifying bite of smoked chili, the demanding, undeniable passion of Tristan. It did not taste like grief. It did not taste like exhaustion. It tasted like home. I opened my eyes. Both of them were watching me, their breaths held waiting. For the first time in 5 years, the corners of my mouth lifted. The muscles in my face felt stiff, foreign, and out of practice, but the smile that broke across my face was entirely, indisputably real. Tristan exhaled a shaky breath, a slow, brilliant smile mirroring mine. Vance's broad shoulders dropped in profound relief, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The war was over, the diner was closed, and I finally knew exactly what I was going to cook for tomorrow. December in Chicago is unforgiving. The wind coming off Lake Michigan does not just freeze you, it actively resents you, turning the city streets into hollowed-out tunnels of ice and gray slush. But inside the Nowhere Diner, it was 72 degrees, smelling strongly of roasted garlic charred rosemary and an absurdly expensive vintage of Barolo. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Thursday. The diner was officially closed. The front window, which had been shattered a year ago, was now reinforced with military-grade ballistic glass, a completely unnecessary birthday gift from Tristan that I had pretended to hate. The buzzing neon sign outside hummed a steady, flawless red, meticulously maintained by Vance, who had apparently decided that basic electrical work was now part of his weekly syndicate duties. I stood by the prep counter, leaning my back against the heavy stainless steel door of the walk-in fridge, wrapping both hands around a ceramic mug of hot chamomile tea. I was watching a disaster unfold in my kitchen. "You are crowding the pan," Tristan said smoothly. Though the vein pulsing at his temple betrayed his irritation, he nudged his tailored French cuffed sleeve further up his forearm to avoid a splatter of hot oil. "It needs space to breathe, Vance. If you drop the temperature of the cast iron now, you will boil the meat instead of searing it. Have you never heard of the Maillard reaction? I have heard of a crowbar to the kneecaps Wall Street, which is exactly what you're going to get if you do not back away from my stove." Vance grunted, using a pair of heavy steel tongs to ruthlessly shove a massive, thick-cut ribeye around the smoking pan. "I have been cooking meat over open fires since before you owned your first Rolex. It is about instinct, not a spreadsheet." They were both wearing the neon yellow hot dog aprons. The visual contrast never stopped being jarring. Two of the most lethal, powerful alphas in the Midwestern United States, men who commanded armies and manipulated global markets, currently bickering like petty children over a piece of beef while wearing blindingly bright synthetic plastic. Tristan had eventually hired a bespoke tailor to alter his apron so it fit his waist more elegantly, a fact I relentlessly mocked him for. Vance had simply stretched his until the cartoon hot dog on his chest looked permanently warped. Julian, tell this barbarian that basting requires butter and time, not brute force, Tristan demanded, looking over his shoulder at me, his dark eyes flashing with competitive fire. Do not drag him into this, Vance rumbled, dropping a generous, reckless chunk of cultured butter into the pan, causing it to hiss violently. He is off the clock. I took a slow sip of my tea, hiding the small, involuntary curve of my lips behind the rim of the mug. I think you both need to lower your voices before you curdle the hollandaise I left in the fridge, I said dryly. They immediately lowered their voices, though the under-the-counter kicking resumed. I could hear the dull thud of Tristan's Italian loafer connecting with Vance's combat boot. I closed my eyes and let the sounds wash over me. The sizzling steak, the soft jazz playing from the vintage radio on the counter, the muffled insults traded between two apex predators who had somehow turned my run-down kitchen into their sanctuary. My psychological adjusia did not disappear overnight like a flipped switch. Trauma rarely works like that. Healing is not a linear ascension. It is a messy, stuttering process. I still had gray days. There were mornings I woke up and the world felt like cardboard and the hollow emptiness threatened to swallow me whole again. But things were different now. When the numbness hit, I was not alone in the vacuum. When my world went quiet, Vance would simply show up, sit at the counter for hours, and clean his collection of handguns in absolute anchoring silence, projecting a protective warmth that tethered me to the ground. And Tristan would arrive in a flurry of arrogant energy, bringing me absurd ingredients, saffron from Iran, truffles from Alba, demanding I insult his poor attempts at making an emulsion until my brain was forced to engage with the present moment. They did not try to magically fix me. They just made damn sure their devotion was loud enough to bleed through the grayness. It is done, Vance announced abruptly, cutting the heat on the heavy gas burner. Tristan immediately stepped in with a pair of silver plating tweezers which he had specifically bought and brought to my diner and began arranging the resting slices of ribeye onto a rustic ceramic plate. He added blistered cherry tomatoes and drizzled a sharp, vibrant chimichurri over the top with surgical precision. They walked out from behind the counter together, bringing the plate to the booth where I usually sat. They took the opposite side, sliding in next to each other. Their shoulders brushed. Neither of them complained. Eat, Vance ordered softly as dark, heavy gaze fixed on me. And evaluate, Tristan added, leaning forward, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. Honestly, I walked over, picked up a fork, and sat across from them. I cut a small piece of the beef, swiped it through the bright green chimichurri, and put it in my mouth. I closed my eyes. It was deeply imperfect. The garlic in the chimichurri had been left on the heat 10 seconds too long, a clear sign of Vance's impatience. The finishing salt was completely unvaried, sprinkled with a sterile mathematical precision that lacked soul, a hallmark of Tristan's overthinking. But underneath the flaws, the flavor profile hit my tongue like a symphony. It tasted like bone-deep loyalty wrapped in sharp, electrifying passion. It tasted like two men who had conquered a city but would gladly burn it to the ground just to keep the lights on in this diner. It tasted like happiness. I opened my eyes, swallowed, and set the fork down. They were both watching me, completely still, holding their breath like I was a judge at the Supreme Court. The garlic is burnt, Vance, I said flatly. Vance scowled. Tristan smirked triumphantly. And Tristan, I continued, turning my gaze to the billionaire. Your plating is pretentious, and your salt distribution is borderline psychotic. Tristan's smirk vanished. Vance let out a booming, gravelly laugh that echoed off the peeling wallpaper. I picked up my fork again and took another bite, a genuine, undeniable smile breaking across my face. But I suppose I will finish it. Tristan exhaled a slow breath, his posture relaxing as his own brilliant, devastating smile answered mine. Vance reached across the table, his large calloused hand gently wrapping over my free hand, his thumb brushing my knuckles with a quiet, grounding heat. The rain hit the ballistic glass outside. The neon sign buzzed. I finally understood it. Love is not a Michelin star. It is not flawless execution, immaculate plating, or a perfect menu. Love is two terrifying monsters wearing neon yellow hot dog aprons, arguing over a cast iron skillet at 2 in the morning just to make sure you have a reason to wake up and cook again tomorrow. And for the first time in my life, tomorrow sounded exactly like something I wanted to taste.